Now I have the pleasure of introducing Judge Judith Hightower and our next panel, which will be Charting a New Path. And I'm really happy to get to introduce Judge Hightower because her whole career has been about fairness and justice and about grassroots and about being an agitator even from the bench. And this is somebody who didn't choose the path to the bench lightly, and she didn't choose it by seeking a judicial appointment. She called all of her friends and got them to write her in. I wrote her in. I remember. I don't know if anybody else has become a judge from a write-in campaign, but she did. And she continues to be a wise force and a thoughtful force for justice. So she's going to lead our next panel. So please join me in welcoming Judge Hightower on our panel.
Thank you and good morning. I hope I can get through this without coughing. So just reminding everybody to turn off your cell phones and pagers again, please. And I'm going to introduce our panel. Here they come. Oh, so we have, well, first of all, Starcia could not be with us today. We're very sad. She was called away on an emergency, so she won't be here. Allison Holcomb. Allison is the ACLU campaigned in mass incarceration. That's what she works with. We have Senator Pramila Jayapal, with the Washington State Legislature. Good morning. We have Chief Deputy Jim Pugel from the King County Sheriff's Office. And Theo has joined us. Thank you so much, Theo. Before we start, I also wanted to tell you that what we hope to do is have a conversation, and we want you to be part of it. But because of some time limits, we put some, what do you call those things? Index cards, thank you, at the end of your tables. If you have questions for the panel, if you would write those down and pass them up, and we will try to get to those questions. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers also. Let's see, what else did I want to say? I know there's one more thing I wanted to tell you. Our senator has to leave to get to a meeting. She's going to have to leave early. So if you have questions of Senator Jayapal, please make sure you get those up to us so we can get to her before she has to leave. Excuse me. Is this my spot? Okay. All right. And I hope I don't have a coughing fit. Sorry about that. So, first of all, mass incarceration, as you know, is increasing and increasingly seen as both a cause and a symptom of major inequities in our culture. So we have a couple of slides that we want to just start with here. Dr. Alexa Harris, a professor here at the University of Washington, who unfortunately could not be with us today, has studied, written, and lectured about mass incarceration and disproportionality. She generously shared some of her work with us for today. And the first slide, see which one is that? I don't have, well, there is a slide, and this isn't the one, but what this one shows, I should get my numbers up. Is this 8? The first one I need is 8. Okay, this slide shows the increase in incarceration of state and federal prisoners from 1925 to 2010. From less than 200,000 until around 1972, you begin to see a dramatic increase, particularly in the 80s, from 400,000 to 1,600,000 by 210. The next slide, 9, hopefully. This shows how we exceed most all other nations in incarceration. You see the United States is over here on the end. And then finally, slide 10 shows that in Seattle and nationally, serious crime has decreased during the period of 1988 to 2012, and yet we've seen an increase in incarceration. So that's kind of the framework for where we want to start this conversation. The Sentencing Project report, Black Lives Matter, published this year, reports that blacks and Latinos comprise 56% of the incarcerated population, and only 30% of the U.S. population. So this panel today will assess the current situation and analyze the forces at play that brought us to this point. Panelists will discuss the ways of moving forward from a variety of perspectives, including law enforcement, policy advocates, and lawmakers. So, first of all, what brings you to this work? Allison?
Good morning. So I came to this work after being a criminal defense attorney for a little over a decade, and I never thought I would wind up doing criminal defense, but I had a good friend who was working at a firm, invited me to come there when one of their lawyers left, and I started to meet the people that were getting pushed into the criminal justice system. And over time, I essentially wound up getting involved with King County Bar Association's drug policy project, and then got recruited to serve on the Seattle City Council's I-75 panel, which was looking at the impacts of making adult marijuana our lowest law enforcement priority, and then wound up serving on the advisory board that was talking to the city about whether or not it needed to build a new jail and what alternatives would be. And the next thing I know, I got a job description in my inbox from a friend who was recruiting me, and he said, "Doesn't this look like fun?" And I forwarded it on to my partner, who then called me at my job and said, "Did you open that job description?" And I said, "No, of course not, I'm working right now." And he said, "Well, you ought to, because it's you." And I wound up getting to move from the side of having to walk people through the criminal justice system to having the possibility of changing the laws that were putting them there. Never in a million years did I think that I would wind up writing a marijuana legalization initiative or leading a campaign to legalize marijuana. I was the kid in high school that all of her friends were smoking marijuana, and I didn't know it. But it was a good experience for me in a lot of ways, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit later. But I'll just say right now, as sort of foreshadowing, I think that the reason this work matters to me so much is that we're undermining democracy in the United States of America. We have decided to use the criminal justice system as the primary tool for dealing with everything that makes us uncomfortable, everything that's going wrong, every social failure. You just get mad at somebody who's not doing things right, and you lock them away. And we've made it worse and worse and worse. And I will just say, slide 1 didn't include local jails. If you would have added local jails into that, you would have pushed the population behind bars up to 2.2 million. And it didn't include how many Americans are walking around with a criminal conviction right now. 1 in 3. Are 1 in 3 Americans criminals? You heard Theo talking about what it means to be walked out in handcuffs. So think about what we are saying to our fellow citizens over and over and over again every day, and what kind of impact that's having on our country.
Thank you. Chief?
There are several things that brought me to this. I've been in, as far as over incarceration, I've been in law enforcement since I graduated from the University of Washington in 1982. And I started as a police officer with the city of Seattle. I rose through the ranks. I made a lot of arrests. I handed those arrests over to the prosecutor. The prosecutor prosecuted all of those. The judges convicted or the juries convicted, and then they went to jail. And then we would go out and arrest again. Later on, I supervised those arrests. I was a captain. I was an assistant chief in various other areas. And it wasn't until about, I'd say about 2009, that it really struck me about how unequal the system was. I think Theo did a very, very beautiful job of explaining what his story is. And one of the terms that he used was collateral damage. And I couldn't agree more. The collateral damage that Allison has also alluded to has affected this country in myriad ways. A lot of our arrests in the Seattle Police Department were drug arrests, and the ACLU and the Racial Disparity Project and the Defender Association brought lawsuits against the police department and the King County Prosecutor's Office for disproportionality, not only in arrests, disproportionality in prosecutions. And those legal actions would be settled, or the class would go away, or the charges would be dropped, but then we'd continue to make these arrests. And they were hugely disproportionate because they were street level, open air drug market arrests. And there's a whole history that I could talk all day or all week about that. We continue to defend ourselves. The prosecutor's office would defend us and themselves from these allegations of disproportionality. So that really got me thinking. Eventually, after motions, and legal actions, about 7 years of them, we all sat down. When one of the police captains asked a very brilliant lady named Lisa Dugard, what would you do if you were being yelled at by the politicians, by the tourism bureau, by the business owners, by the residents who live in downtown, and they want you to arrest all these people, and the prosecutors are prosecuting them, and the judges are convicting, and the jails are taking them? And Lisa said, I don't know. And that started an initiative called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, where we take the low-level, non-violent, non-predatory drug user, drug addict, drug dealer, who's a subsistence-level drug dealer, and at point of arrest, we give them the option of complete wraparound treatment, for lack of a better word. They may not need drug treatment because they're not addicts, but they're consuming to an extent that they are causing significant harm to themselves and to their community and to their families and loved ones. And the person can avail themselves with the plan that they've come up with, their case manager with, to comprehensive plans of recovery, if that's what's needed, to job training, to education, to housing, to hygiene, to medical treatment. But it's also, and through that initiative, I've been doing a lot of reading. I've been fortunate to be participating on several national panels that are looking at the national problem. And I go back to the collateral damage. Not only is the dignity and the civil rights of the incarcerated person at severe risk, but we have over-penalized them and over-criminalized them through about 35 to 40 years of taking away judge discretion, making determinate sentencings where the judge can't individually analyze a case. We have given or mandated mandatory sentences. We've done 3 strikes, you're out. And then we've taken away the ability to use federal or state money to get education while you're imprisoned in most, if not all, of the states. We as a nation have penalized a person when they get out, because there's over 100 jobs just in the state of Washington that if you have a felony conviction, regardless of what the felony was, you cannot qualify for the license to have that job. You cannot qualify for public housing. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to get student loans or a Pell Grant. And not only that, but the collateral effects that it has on the children. There's a tremendous book that just came out a couple of weeks ago. It's Children of the Prison Boom, Oxford University, 2 professors there. And it's chapter after chapter about the collateral damage that we are realizing now, but we're going to realize even if we stopped over incarceration and returned to the early 1900s about what the rate should be, we're going to be dealing with the children who have not had parents, usually fathers, quite often, and increasing not mothers at home. And the challenges, the homelessness, the dropout rates, the runaway rates, the health issues, the psychological issues that these children have now and will be dealing with for the next 40 years. That is what has brought me to this, and why it's very, very worth your time to pay attention to this and get involved in it as well.
Well, that took care of about half the questions. Senator.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all so much for being here. Michelle, thank you for helping to put this together. Theo, thank you for your amazing words, but more importantly, your amazing work and spirit. I come to this work actually as an activist. first originally working on poverty issues internationally, and then after 9/11, seeing something happen at the bottom of my street where Somali stores, grocery stores, were being shut down because of post 9/11 terrorist threats. And ended up, that started a long set of work around specifically immigrant rights, but tying to a larger question of justice, civil rights, and building a movement for change. And so that work at the beginning around immigration was really centered around Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians that were targeted post 9/11 and the civil liberties abuses that were happening against those communities. But very quickly, we realized this was not just about post 9/11 communities, as we used to call them at the time, but really about a larger movement for immigrant justice. And as we expanded into doing work on federal immigration reform, on immigration detention, we also understood that it wasn't just about immigrants either. It was about the Black and brown communities that were being targeted in so many different ways. And as we did that work, we realized it wasn't just about those communities either. It was really about how do we collectively build a different society and a different movement for change. And so the work has been incredible, in part because of people like Theo, people who do put themselves on the line every day, have experienced discrimination, come forward to tell those stories, to make it real. And now, as a state senator, I ran for election last year, and I have to tell you, I didn't know if I wanted to do it, and I still don't know if I really want to do it. But what I realized is we could not cede the territory of the political world to people who did not bring the perspectives and the views that we have on the ground in the organizing community. And so I now sit as the only woman of color in the state Senate. I am one of only 5 people of color in the state Senate, and very few overall in the legislature. And I say that not because I want cheers from myself, but for people to really understand that the work we're trying to do as agitators is not easy, because the people that we are often speaking to, our own colleagues in the legislature, do not come from the same perspectives, experiences, and views that we have. And so when I'm testifying before a panel on around education, and I had several bills around racial disproportionality this session, none of which made it out of committee. Maybe we'll get a budget proviso for one of them to do a study. But the questions I'm having to answer are, what do you mean? What is racial disproportionality? What is the evidence that shows that there is racial disproportionality in the system? And I'll tell you something about data. The Washington State Institute for Public Policy has been doing a series of studies on the most effective ways of reducing incarceration and getting people back to work, getting people back into productive society. There are some wonderful things about data, but there's also a lot of problems with data, because what we do when we look at data is we look at cost. And the cost is typically the cost of incarceration. We are not talking about the cost that Theo was talking about. We're not talking about the cost of the spirit, of the soul, of human beings in being able to live productive lives. The whole conversation is focused around cost, benefit as it relates to the cost of incarceration, the actual physical cost of incarceration, the dollar cost of incarceration. So our work is supreme. It's incredibly important. But what I have learned is that even the bills that we think should be no-brainers are not no-brainers. We did finally pass in the state Senate, which is controlled by Republicans. This is not a partisan statement, it's just true. The state Senate is controlled by Republicans. The House is controlled by Democrats. The Senate finally passed a bill revamping our property crime laws. We are the only state in the country that doesn't actually use supervision as a means of addressing property crimes. The state House has passed bills to reform legal financial obligations, to address the Certificate of Restoration for Opportunity, which allows people who are coming out who are ex-felons to actually be able to get a certificate that allows them to work. And when I was on the campaign trail, we knocked on something like 25,000 doors. I went to several voters that are not considered the people that you normally talk to. They're called 1 of 4 voters or 2 of 4 voters. Those are people that have voted in the last 1 of 4 elections or the last 2 of 4 elections. They typically don't get visited, they don't get mail because they're not frequent voters. I went to talk to them. I had in numerous blocks in my district, which by the way is one of the most diverse, economically and racially diverse districts in the state. I had ex-felon after ex-felon, and these guys were amazing guys. I ended up in long conversations, not what you're supposed to do at the door, but what you're supposed to do as a human being, right, is listen to people at the doors. And what they told me is, how can I even begin to rebuild my life? If I made a mistake, how do I even address it? Because I have debt, I have no opportunity for a job, I have no opportunity to get an education, and let's not even talk about whether or not they were in there for the right reasons in the first place. Many of them hadn't done the crimes that they said they had done. So our work is really about changing, as Theo said, changing the narrative and redefining what our narrative is. Recognizing that within the state houses, the state legislatures across the country, we do not have the people we need to have there. And so to many of you in the audience who have thought, I'm never going to do politics, it's dirty, I'll tell you it is. It is actually dirty, and it is controlled by corporate lobbyists who are not advocating for the things that we are advocating for. But let me tell you, you should run, and you should be involved, or you should at least come down to Olympia and make your voices heard, because there is no way we are going to change the system without addressing the actual game of politics. And I say game because it is kind of a game. And if you want to see the ultimate version of social control, you should go to Olympia, because what bills make it through are all determined by which party is in power and which party gets to move a bill through committee. And if you agitate too loudly, you do not get your bills moved forward. I know that firsthand because I helped lead a 2.5 debate on payday lending, which is directly related, by the way, to all of these things that we're talking about. A bill to try to roll back restrictions that we have around payday lending. And I led a 2.5-hour debate on the floor with Senator Nelson, and we lost. And I didn't get any bills through for the next couple of days. So that's what happens, right? But does it mean that we are done? Absolutely not. We have to continue to talk about what is wrong, but also be willing to continue to think creatively about how we move things forward and how we organize in our districts. I come from an organizing tradition. I'm a community organizer, and I'm intending to organize within the legislature as soon as I can figure out how the damn place works. And then, but I also need help organizing on the outside. And that means talking to not just people like us. And it may mean using language that isn't always comfortable for us. And it may mean having people that aren't actually the people that are affected sometimes do the talking. And this is one of the hardest strategic choices I think I've seen people having to make. Because we should have the people who are at the forefront of the injustice telling their stories, and we need to make sure that that happens. But many of these people who sit on these policy committees don't have those people in their districts. So unless we're going to all move so that the 37th gets less diverse, which I'm not advocating for, and other places in central and eastern Washington get more diverse, we're going to have a problem. I want to just say one last thing, which is there was an incident recently that happened, some of you may have heard about it, in the Senate Ways and Means Committee, and it was around the question of racial disproportionality statements. There was a bill that Senator Hasegawa had that I was a sponsor of, similar bill to what I had around education. And in the hearing, one of the senators, a Republican senator, basically made a statement that linked poor people to crime, and therefore poor people, the majority of poor people are black and brown. It's poor people who commit crimes, therefore black and brown people commit crimes. And he used other words. He actually used the word colored. And it was deeply distressing, not just because of the words, But because of the implications, again, around how data is used and how people perceive these issues. So that link, you could actually factually make the arguments for each of those individual statements that he was making, but because they weren't addressing the disproportionality that underlies each of those factual statements, you could be lured into thinking that data is showing that Black and brown people commit crimes, and always will, is the part that wasn't said, right? That there's something inherent in us being Black or brown that has us committing crimes. It was deeply offensive, but tied to that statement was the ongoing efforts to suppress the voices of Black and brown people across the state. This senator happens to be one of the people that has been holding up the Voting Rights Act, which would allow for people to actually elect people who represent them in places like Yakima, for example. This senator is probably against the legal financial obligations bill, which passed, by the way, almost unanimously in the House. And so I think what we have to do is find a way with compassion. I did not pile on to that statement publicly because I didn't actually think it was useful for us on the inside. I thought an outside organizing strategy around that was fabulous. But an inside strategy is to figure out how we start to have honest conversations about what people are saying when they say these things and how they feel to those of us who are Black and brown, as well as to those of us who are white, who are in allyship around a more just and peaceful world. And so I still have a lot of hope. I'm not quite sure why, but I still have a lot of hope because I believe that our work, if it was easy, it would have been done. The work that we're doing now is about reversing centuries of injustice and prejudice and racism and discrimination. And so it doesn't change overnight. But it is people like Theo. It is people like one of the guys I met on the doors who couldn't vote, came out and worked with me and knocked on doors during the campaign because he felt like he couldn't just stay home and let people be right about him. That was what he said. I can't let people be right about me. I'm not going to go back to crime. I'm going to do something good with my life. And that is the hope and the resilience of people that we are representing in whatever way we're doing that, whether it's through nonprofits, whether it's in the state legislature, whether it's as neighbors. And that is really the beauty of the path forward. And I think we'll talk a lot about the challenges. So I just wanted to end with the beauty and the hope and the resilience of people who have been fighting for the good and the fair and the just. Thank you.
Well, that took up most of the questions I had to ask the panel. Do you have any questions? Has anybody written any questions so far for us or has a question? I see one. Why don't you just go ahead and come to the microphone at this point? And if you want to direct it to a particular person, say who, please.
Well, I have a lot of questions and a long speech to make, but I'll say
One question.
what I wrote down was over the past decade, the average length of sentences in Washington state has increased by 27%. And what do you think we should do about that to reverse it?
Who would like to take that question? Allison?
Sure. We need to shorten them. And by the way, it's very good to see you. I'm Mary Helen Roberts. Thank you so much for working on these issues for as long as you have. Not just here in Washington, but nationwide, a big driver is the harshness of penalties, going back to mandatory minimums getting passed first in Congress in the 1980s around drug offenses, and that primarily being political football. Who could be more tough on crime than the other side? So the Democrats and the Republicans sort of kept ramping up the sentences. There are three big drivers of sentencing that I think we need to repeal right away. One, of course, is the mandatory minimums. Another is 3 strikes, you're out. And a third is this truth in sentencing type of law that says that you have to serve at least 85% of your sentence. It's useful to have some historical perspective on this as sort of kind of a warning to all of us that are working in this area. we got to this place in part through good intentions. That's always the way the road to hell is paved. And it was, in one part, liberals who were concerned about the fact that in the absence of having sentencing guidelines, that judges were using their discretion to sentence people of color to harsher sentences than white defendants who committed similar offenses. And what happened when we got sentencing guidelines is that all the sentences got worse. And so now everybody is suffering, and judges have very little discretion. And as Theo explained very well, prosecutors are usually the ones that determine the outcome in particular cases, because of course if you have a really long sentence and the prosecutor gets to decide what kind of plea to offer you, it leaves you with a lot less choice than many of us would think. So I would say repealing those three types of laws and then going back and looking at the length of sentences. And when you start to look at the length of sentences question, you get into exactly what the good senator is talking about, is that you have to talk about cost-benefit analysis, I think. So the way that I approached Initiative 502 was to figure out, how do I get this law passed? There is a big, huge, deep, broad narrative story that we have to work on. My job working at the ACLU is to cut our incarceration rates in half by 2020. And I'm looking for pragmatic ways to get that ball rolling. And so I am going to be looking at cost-benefit analyses. But in doing that and in looking at sentences and figuring out how we can argue, because we do have data out there that tells us that you don't need, Pew's Center on the States is already looking at this. We have data that says we don't need to be putting people behind bars as long as we are. The interesting question is, what do you do with the criminal justice savings? The Council on State Governments and the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, also what the Senator was talking about in reforming our property laws. What the idea is, you come into a state and you see what you can get the five corners of government to agree on, the leadership of the two chambers, as well as the governor. What can you get them to agree on in terms of reforming criminal justice laws and recapturing savings? And then the idea is to reinvest those savings into the communities. So far, we've had mixed results on states that have adopted these changes. In some cases, the prosecutors are able to just go around whatever that was, because they can pick other things to charge and they can get the same kind of sentences that they want. So how do we take the savings and reinvest it in structural changes that actually start to change the narrative? And another thing that I'm really interested in looking at is, how do we change the funding metrics and outcomes? The Brennan Center on Justice has published some interesting work around federal grants that go to state and local law enforcement, and talking about, instead of, for example, basing how much money you give to a local law enforcement agency on how many arrests they make and how many kilos of cocaine they seize, what if instead you're incentivizing them by how many people got GEDs after you arrested them, how many people got into treatment, how many people had something good happen that actually has an impact on public safety? And it was one of Jim Pugel's detectives during a LEAD seminar that summed it up beautifully when she said, or during a meeting, she said, what's been amazing about LEAD is it's gotten the law enforcement officers that are working with LEAD to think about public safety instead of law enforcement. Our criminal justice system is about the wins. It's prosecutors versus defense attorneys, and a win is defined by a conviction and how long of a sentence you got. So if we could change the metrics and do it in a fiscal way, start rewarding law enforcement officers for something different, maybe that would have an impact in the near term.
The only thing I might add to that really quickly is, at the same time that we are seeing some success in different sectors, for example, the property crimes one of using supervision instead of incarceration, there's also a number of laws that take us right back. So there was a bill that we just voted on that if it suspends a license for not paying your child support. And so we have to be really careful in looking at each of these areas and making sure that we're not adding to the incarceration rates, because sometimes it's buried in there, sometimes it's complex. There are domestic violence situations where you might think one thing is good, but you're really thinking about the disproportionate burden that particularly people of color are going to face and low-income people are going to face is really important in each individual arena.
Are there any prosecutors in the room? No? It's unfortunate. All right, I'll skip that one then.
Judge,
Yes.
I'd like to add one more thing. I and many others are into numbers. And the question was, how do we reduce the lengths of sentences? All research shows that any sentence, even for the most serious crime, anything over 5 years isn't effective. In fact, most sentences of a few months with structured probation or parole is very effective. Most of those offenses that we're putting people in jail now really shouldn't be going to jail. And we didn't put those folks in jail before 1982, 1983. Another thing that we have to think of is even if you have a very pro-prison person, usually whether they're conservative or liberal or in the middle, everyone's concerned about money. We will not be able to afford the medical care that these lifers are going to be costing us as a society. Back before 1980, 1985, the vast majority of our prisoners were in their 20s. And then they would get out. Now we have the average person in state prison is about 48, and it's getting older and older and older. And those people have huge health issues. It's a lot less expensive to treat those health issues outside of prison. When we have Newt Gingrich and the Koch brothers, who are very conservative, are coming now out in favor of prison reform and sentence reform. Part of that is due to the cost. We just can't afford it, even if we take all the moral imperatives out of it.
So Theo talked about changing the narrative that criminalizes black and brown existence. And, excuse me, as I look at this chart that we had up about when we see the rise, and one of my questions to you all was, how we got here. And if you look at and Allison's already made reference to the tough on crime, the war on drugs that started back in the 70s and 80s, where we see this increase occur. So, and everyone has referenced the disproportionality and the challenge in the conversation. And so Michelle Alexander refers to mass incarceration in her book, The New Jim Crow, as a caste system, she uses a caste system analysis. And she talks about the fact that institutional racism is structured to continue to protect privilege and property and adapts in order to maintain white privilege through rules, rhetoric, change. So do you agree with that? And if that's the case, then how do we talk about this to make a difference? Theo?
I was thinking that's a very profound question. I agree with Professor Alexander's comment about the caste system and about it as a way of protecting property and privilege. But I think the question we have to sort of counterpose to those in power is because I don't think the problem is with us. Our existence is criminalized and seen as problematic ontologically. There's a difference, I think, when we're talking about our justice systems, when we talk about problems, because as I said from the start, my premise where black and brown lives don't matter in our justice systems, see, whites are allowed, as Michelle says in her books, in her speeches, whites are allowed to have problems, whereas people of color are viewed as the problem. There's a difference, and the latter is ontological. And as far as our allowing the narrative of letting the politics of fear and anger dictate our policy, I think we have to have a clear vision, a clear statement, a clear counter narrative as far as where we want to go. But I think the price that has to be paid for that vision has to come from those who are in power. I don't think the problem is necessarily with us. I think the price for ultimately rectifying these issues is going to have to come from those who are in power and what they're going to have to give up for restraining our freedom to a large extent.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
If I could. So I think where Michelle Alexander is definitely absolutely 100% correct is with respect to the war on drugs. Because with the war on drugs, what we know is that white Americans use and sell drugs at slightly higher rates than brown and black Americans. And brown and black Americans go to jail much more frequently. African Americans are 13% of the population, but 30% of the drug arrests and 40% of the people behind bars for drugs. The tricky part is all the other offenses. As Senator Jayapal referenced earlier, you can look at the data and you can make the case that, for example, African Americans commit more violent crimes proportionately than other people, right? That's where we have to get into the deeper conversation. And I think in order to move forward, we have to look back farther than we have. The civil rights era is a place that we can look and we can say that that's when conservatives, anti-civil rights agitators were successful in linking civil disobedience and the demand for rights with criminality, right? And that is part of the narrative of what happened in the 70s and 80s when we started to see mass incarceration go up. But in order to make the case that there's a different solution going forward, I think it's helpful to go back to the progressive era, because in the progressive era, white criminality was tied to the stress and strains of industrial capitalism, and the response was more services, more public infrastructure, more education, more assistance to the white immigrants in urban environments. That was the response then. Why can't it be the response now for everybody? So I think the task that we have ahead of us is to articulate a positive solution going forward. At the same time that we're pointing out, the only reason we aren't pursuing that solution is because of the color of people's skins. If we knew that we could do this in the progressive area, but we had a different response when the city's deindustrialized, when crack cocaine was introduced into South Central Los Angeles and became, for many people, their means of support, because the government didn't invest in new public infrastructure, didn't invest in services, didn't invest in the things that could help families that no longer had a job to go to, right? We can articulate that there is a different response, but I think having that historical perspective to make it clear that we've simply chosen not to do that is important.
I was going to go right where Allison went, and I think it's really, really important that we think about, we have multiple prongs that we have to work on, because if you just look at the data, you really can make some of those arguments that people are making in order to point the finger at African Americans or Latinos. And the problem is with what the underlying reasons are for the data being the way it is, right? So when you look at education as an example, and you see that 75% of the people who are the kids who are dropping out of school are black and brown, but you also then look at the same statistics around how public schools are funded or not funded in our case, or you look at a number of other pieces around supports for kids who, for example, have a parent who's, one parent who's trying to hold down a job, but it's a minimum wage job and it's a part-time job, right? So there are all these different pieces that come into what we think of as the support system that allows for a kid to really be able to succeed and to be able to be healthy and resilient. The problem is the data only looks at what the ultimate result is. It doesn't look at the causes for that result. And so I just caution around data. I understand we have to use it. I understand many people want to use it. I understand that it's incredibly useful to us in a state legislation capacity in particular circumstances. If we were to wait for all the data to come back, for example, on things like law enforcement assisted diversion programs, or things that we intuitively know are going to be helpful, we are going to be waiting a long time. And that is often, I think that's the challenge we have. And so we do need to think about how we move our efforts forward on multiple prongs, because when you have prisons being built based on third grade scores of kids, right? That's how they determine where prisons are going to be built, based on the third grade scores of test scores of kids. there's a problem. And it means that we also have to focus on education. We have to focus on the safety net. And we have to focus on economic issues that allow people to actually make a living. And so right now, the debate around the minimum wage bill is kind of fascinating to me, because we're talking about a $12 minimum wage, and with 70% of public approval across the state. And yet we're being told that that is too high. That's only about $1.30 increase over the next 4 years. What does that mean to a person, to a mom, to a single mom who's trying to raise her kid? It's huge. It matters. And so I just want us to be thinking about incarceration in the context of, sort of like if you think about a hub and spokes, right? That there's all these other spokes that are around the system of incarceration that we also have to be moving forward at the same time and making the links to.
Chief, I have a question from the audience for you. How do we engage law enforcement and prosecutors who are very powerful in Olympia, and it looks like at sentencing? I see few in the room today, as we determined there are none in the room today.
What is the question again? I'm sorry.
Who asked this question? Go ahead. Whose question is it to Chief Bugel about? There you are. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Kim Ambrose. I teach here at the law school. Thanks so much to all of you for coming. And I guess this is to you, Chief Deputy Pugel, because you are our token law enforcement here today. I go to Olympia occasionally when I'm invited, and it's usually painful to testify often. And I notice that they're really, our legislature is really interested in what prosecutors and law enforcement have to say when they're passing bills, and it's same at the local level. There's a lot of power there. And yet, when we have these types of meetings, I don't see law enforcement here or prosecutors here at the table. So if you have some ideas, and I love the LEAD project, I know that's been fairly successful, but it took 7 years of litigating to get people at the table together, and I don't think we have 7 more years to get people to really talk to each other. So how do we engage with law enforcement and with prosecutors, especially when they're not always we're not in the same rooms together?
I would say the most important thing is have those law enforcement leaders, have the police, have those who educate the law enforcement in our academies go back to what our basic premise is, and that's community health and safety. Back in 1829, there was a minister in London, Sir Robert Peel, and he was the founder of modern policing. He organized the first official police department. And if you guys have a chance later, look up the 9 Peelian principles. But it all goes back to if we were to observe those 9 principles of policing, which includes, to me, the most salient is the 7th principle. It states that the community are the police and the police are the community. The police being paid full-time to pay attention to issues that we are all responsible in order for the health and the safety of the community. Now that's paraphrased. The legislators, the elected officials, everyone can get a vote if they say they're tough on crime. But we have to be smart on crime. And I think that we have to go out there, things that myself and other law enforcement people are doing, educate our peers onto what the causes of disproportionality are, what the results of disproportionality and over-incarceration are. Once we get those sheriffs, those prosecutors, those police chiefs educated, and have them focus back on what our essential roots are, then we will be able to convince the elected official, present company accepted, many who are terrified of not being tough on crime. And it's way too easy for them to vote for longer sentences or more prisons or other harsh alternatives to what the right thing to do is.
Thank you. I have a couple questions that are related to the challenges and the dangers in collaborating with the Right on Crime, Koch brothers, those kind of entities. And what do we lose when we are strategic in that way?
Well, I have the Right on Crime principles here because I actually printed them out, and there's a couple of them that aren't so bad, and then there's other ones that are not so great, and I think we have to use them strategically, understanding that pushing for short-term reform at the cost of our long-term principles is not going to benefit us. And so looking at these principles, there are things where an ideal criminal justice system works to reform amenable, I wouldn't use amenable, but reform amenable offenders who will return to society through harnessing the power of families, charities, faith-based groups, and communities. Well, I'm a community organizer. I can read into that principle what I want to read into it and make it sound like something that fits with what I think about. So if the words are going to help us to move people but not hurt our long-term agenda, then I think we should be thinking about how to use them strategically. If they are going to hurt our long-term agenda, and for example, constitutionally limited government, personal responsibility, which in and of itself may not sound like a terrible thing until you know what gets attached to it, right? Then we have to be very careful. Free enterprise. Some of these things are complex, and we should just think about what allows us to still speak the truth, speak our truth, while at the same time bringing people on board. Because it is true that in Olympia, we don't have enough people like us, all of the people that are on the panel, and all of the people that are in the room talking about these issues. So that means we have to start where people are, and we have to move them to the right place. And how do we do that without compromising our long-term goals? Judge Hightower, is there anything else for me, or should I?
Well, let's see. There's a question about what works. There's a question about data. Do you want to? Does anyone have a particular question for the senator before she has to leave?
I wish I could. I actually
can.
was supposed to leave at 10. I am on the healthcare committee, which we are dealing with incredibly important issues on healthcare. And we have our healthcare committee right now, which I'm missing, but I want to try and get back in time to vote on the bills. Mary Roberts knows exactly what I'm talking about, but we're going to have to move
We
some
need her
bills out
there.
of committee.
So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you
Senator.
all so much.
I have to leave the room for just a moment, so I'm going to have Allison address the second part of that question. Ask Murph to come and field the others till I get back, please.
I'll just quickly add on to Senator Jayapal's comments. If you aren't aware of it, there was in mid-February a coalition for public safety rolled out. It has a website, and it includes the ACLU along with FreedomWorks, Right on Crime, the Faith and Freedom Coalition, Americans for Tax Reform, and then on the ACLU's on the left, although we're nonpartisan, we get bunched on the left. And we're there with the Leadership Conference on Education, as well as, not Move On, I'm trying to remember the other organization. But I'm actually going to Washington, D.C. this week, both to meet with the state work group out of that coalition, and also to participate in Van Jones and Newt Gingrich's Cut 50 Summit. And so I would encourage you to monitor the things that get said on those websites and to contact me if you think things are going astray. But I agree 100% with Senator Jayapal that we have to find the points of agreement and build on those and hopefully expand the conversation. I would also recommend a book, Jonathan Haidt's, H-A-I-D-T, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. It really gets at the values that underpin liberal and conservative arguments and helps us find ways to bridge and talk to people's values instead of just the cost-benefit analysis. The other question that was on this card, though, was what about Marie Gottschalk's new book, Caught, that argues that all of the reforms, all the criminal justice reforms on the table right now would only make a small dent in the prison population. This is an excellent book. I haven't gotten all the way through it. It's a really nice, I think, companion book for the new Jim Crow. And I would say, so all of the reforms that are on the table right now are pretty minimal, right? They aren't the reforms that I'm thinking about. And I had this, it's a great question. I had this very interesting experience this weekend. I participated in the Citizen University Conference and did a workshop. We were talking about mass incarceration, and I asked the group to brainstorm with me how they would divide up categories of things that are currently crimes. And I said, what would you call, what would you put in the category of things that should remain crimes and should also involve being locked up? Things that would be crimes, but you shouldn't get locked up for it. And then things that shouldn't be crimes. And then I asked everybody to think about what's your definition of crime? And it was a very refreshing reminder that the knee-jerk reaction to calling something a crime that is upsetting, that shouldn't happen, is a big hurdle for us. So for me, it would be really easy to cut the prison population in half if we just decided that we weren't going to put anybody that fell into the non-violent, and I'm using air quotes because there's a lot of stuff that gets called violent that I wouldn't put in the violent category. But if we just took everybody out that was in there for a non-violent crime, that's 46% of the people that are in state prisons right now. And that doesn't even touch the people that are in jail for not being able to post bail. So we could get to 50% like that, actually. But people aren't talking about that because it still hasn't even crossed our mind that jail isn't necessarily the right tool for certain things that happen that aren't supposed to happen. So I think we have to have that conversation. We have to get people really thinking about what it means to be charged with a crime, what it means to have handcuffs put on you. What does it mean that right now that's a rite of passage for African American men in our country? That we don't even know what crime means anymore. We throw that around whenever we get, the slightest offense, something that's uncomfortable happens to us, we think, let's make that a crime. We just saw this with the city council, right? Deciding that the response to being concerned about women being trafficked was to pass a new offense and to create harsher penalties for people that pay sex workers for sex without consulting with any of the sex workers. Okay? That's using a hammer. That's using a giant blunt object to deal with what is a very complicated issue. And that's our gut reaction still, even in progressive Seattle. It's to keep criminalizing because somehow that's going to fix the problem, that there are, in fact, women that are being trafficked. So we have to slow down and think about why we keep calling things crimes and why we keep thinking that making the punishment harsher is somehow going to stop those things from happening.
Thank you. Okay. The one. That what you asked. Okay. Thank you. All right. There's a question, and if someone asks a question and I'm not saying it, please get up and come to the microphone and get it right. So this one is, how do we hold the Department of Corrections accountable for their role in rehabilitation? DOC programs exclude large numbers of prisoners and keep the public out. Changing in prison is very difficult, and DOC is largely unchallenged. How can we change this to support change? And those working on change on the inside. Anyone have any thoughts about that?
Well, as an advocate for the Southern Poverty Law Center, I know one of the things that we sort of have utilized as far as holding not only the Department of Corrections responsible, but also these sort of private companies who are now in control of a lot of our prisons, because that's in large part, a significant part of the problem is now that we have corporate interests in prisons. And so just to sort of build on what Alice was saying is, as far as why we call certain things crimes, is because we have built all these prisons and we need people to fill them. If you all ever come to New Orleans, if you saw this new jail, you would think it was like a university library. It's a beautiful building. And you pass it on the interstate, and like every time I see it, I'm like, wow, I can't believe that's a jail. And so as far as accountability, one of the things we are doing is we are going into these difficult spaces, going into these jails, seeing what's going on, interviewing hundreds and hundreds of inmates, and getting experts to go in to see if we need to sue, and sort of seeing how we can get the federal courts involved as far as like supervising or putting in place an independent monitor who would oversee reform in the jail, and making sure that there's a cultural shift in the way that we sort of house inmates in the state of Louisiana, specifically in New Orleans.
Anyone else here to address that? I have so many good questions here. We're supposed to wrap up at 11, so I'm going to try to get as many of these in, and I have one more question for the panel I hope to get also. So this is for the chief. This is about the new Juvenile Justice Center that's being built, and I want to say something about that before I pose this question to you, and that Superior Court Judge Susan Craig had issued a news release in February entitled "A Call to Action to Address Racial Disproportionality in the Juvenile Justice System," and said that judges have, said that leaders of the justice system must take responsibility for their role in this inequity and do something to change. So whose responsibility is this? And the question is to the chief is, why don't we see support from you or the police department on the issue to campaign against the new youth jail?
Well, I know that is a very controversial subject. Law enforcement has weighed in on it to a degree. I think anyone who's been to the current facility would say it's terrible. It is an inhumane building built when I was a kid and grew up not far away from there. It's antiquated. It is not. It doesn't provide any dignity to the children or to the visitors or the families who have their children there. I believe King County, through bipartisan forces and through our judges and through Dan Satterberg, have done a good job at reducing the population there. There is a legitimate need for reasonable and thoughtful detention of a small amount of youth. How to do it best, I don't think anyone has ever found the perfect way to do it. We have to look at what we are incarcerating youth for. We have to clearly understand the almost certain damage that it can do and the harm that it can cause if it's done improperly. I think the University of Washington has a great professor here, Dr. Casey Trupin, who's done years and years of work on the effects of incarceration of youth and the public health and the mental health of everyone who touches it. I don't think it should be built for a certain capacity. I think King County's headed in the right direction. But to be honest, and having been involved in criminal issues almost my entire life, we do need a certain place for the temporary detention of youth until we find the best course of treatment or care to help them rehabilitate.
And I just add that the judge has called for groups. He's called to the community, education, social services, any number of people to come together to discuss this and what the needs are. You have to remember that it's just not for detention. It's a place where youth and their families can go, not to the adult court, but into the juvenile system. So it may be that our juvenile system needs to be rehabilitated from the bottom up, but you all have to be part of that conversation. And she's asking us all to be a part of that conversation. Did anybody else want to speak to that? No. Okay. Theo, I have a question for you. How can we help counter excessive judicial activism that erodes current civil rights protections, such as in the Supreme Court and in more local courts?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes. In fact, I can hand it to you if you'd like. And you might pass that question if you want.
How can we help counter? I don't think I understand the question.
All right. So there is, for example, there were some cases, I wish I have materials over there, I forgot to bring to the table, where the Supreme Court has refused to find that racism played any part in a death penalty case.
Mikelsky.
Okay,
versus
there it
Kemp.
is. That's right. All right. So if that is judicial activism at the level of the Supreme Court that refuses to see that out of fear or whatever, and maybe who asked the question? I should let you ask the question too to make sure we're asking, getting it right. Great job. Okay. All right. So, so how do we counter that? What do we do to challenge courts, judges, to not behave in ways that ignore the issues that we're trying to address?
Well, I mean that is a really good question. As you mentioned, in Mikelsky versus Kemp, I think this was a Supreme Court case back in the 70s, where the court had a study, the Baldus study, that showed that in Georgia, blacks were more likely to be subjected to the death penalty when the victim is white compared to a black victim. It is my sort of opinion that as far as our justice systems are concerned, that as long as there is a sort of neutral reason, sort of an objective reason to arrest or detain someone, that the sort of race component is not important to the courts. I believe that to be true for young people up until adults. Specifically how we address that, I'm not sure. I know within the education context, you could usually sort of deploy racial disparate theories. I don't think they're as effective when we're talking about sort of challenging racial discrimination in our criminal justice systems. At least if it's not something sort of malicious or implicit racial motivation.
Anyone else want to speak to that? Judicial activism?
Not directly, but if anyone gets a chance, read this month issue of the Atlantic magazine that has a great article on the U.S. Supreme Court. How everyone in the U.S. Supreme Court is a former appeals court judge or some other type of federal judge. In the past, when we had the really monumental civil rights decisions, few, if any, had been federal judges. They had been elected officials, they had been appointed officials, some had been educators in the field of law. It's a very good article, and it explains to an extent of why we have such a divided court right now.
There's a question that asks about data, and someone says they're from Eastern Washington. And the question is, and I don't know if anyone on the panel has this, so there may be somebody in this room that has this information. What is the dropout rate of whites looking at only whites, and what is the dropout rate looking at blacks within the black population? So comparing whites to whites and blacks to blacks. Anybody have that information? Anybody speak to that? No, I have it. I don't have it with me though. All right. Another question was for the law schools, which is what suggestions do you have to better train law students to address and solve these complex issues? Michelle? Yes. Come to the microphone, please. You have about 5 more minutes, so I'm going to wrap this up.
Hi, my name is Kendra, and I go here to UW Law. I'm a second-year law student, and I'd like to speak to that question. We have a lot of conversations about this, although not nearly as many as I think are necessary. And one of the things that I think would be useful to this topic would be to have more of those conversations. I'm sorry, I'm very nervous right now for some reason. I don't usually get nervous public speaking, so this is unusual. I think it would be actually, I don't know if this is something that we can do. I usually get met with pushback when I suggest things like this, but I think it would be actually really important to have some sort of mandatory discussion of this nature. because people do not want to have these conversations, and I would really like to make them. Really, really like that. When we've tried to have conversations like this, the closest that I've come in my experience to having a conversation of this nature in a 1L class was in my crim law class, and it was really uncomfortable, and anyone who spoke got met with a lot of anger and frustration, and a lot of resistance and privilege, and it was just really difficult. And I think that making it a more common occurrence would make it a less difficult thing to talk about. So that's just something that I think would be helpful.
I'll speak to that a little bit. Having attempted in the judiciary to have judges be involved in diversity training and facing that same resistance and understanding now why. If somebody feels they're being called a racist, even though that's not what you're doing, people get very defensive, and it is, as everyone in here knows, a very difficult conversation. One of the more successful things that I have seen is Dr. Leticia Nieto and her presentations on oppression and explaining oppression and how to deal with that. And perhaps you can lobby the law school that in your first year you have a cultural competency class that brings Dr. Nieto in. So try that.
And if I could add one thing to that, having been through some racial justice trainings at work, I would love to actually get that contact information, because what I find is the conversations surface the problem, describe the problem, people speak to their experiences with that problem, and then everyone walks away raw and frustrated and disempowered. And I would love for there to be developed a curriculum that gives people some breathing space and brings them back and just keeps bringing them back until we start to articulate solutions and things that we're willing to try. Because I've yet to participate in a program like that. So something that points the way forward.
All right. I have one last question for the panel, which is how long have we been here before? I recall studies from the 70s and early 80s, one right here from the University of Washington discussing disproportionate incarceration of black men. Well-meaning people have developed so-called race-neutral measures, and there's been some progress in some areas that we know. We've talked about LEAD and other things. Here in Washington in particular, we're doing better than in some other places like Louisiana. But what do you really think can make a difference now? Do you think we can make a difference? And if you think so, why? I mean, what gives you hope? How do we address these issues?
I would just say very briefly, President Obama in his, I think it was his most recent State of the Union, talked about how America had a profound sort of sense of justice. I think when it comes to dealing with the challenges in our criminal justice system, what the public has demonstrated, in my opinion, is a profound sense of indifference. I don't think we have enough people committed to the uncomfortable truth of knowing what's going on in our justice system, specifically when we're talking about racial justice, if it's in a social or educational setting. When we're having these conversations, if people think they're going to continue to be comfortable and unmoved by other people's sort of experiences with injustice, then I don't think those are the people who need to be in the room, especially if they want to continue to remain comfortable. But I think we need to continue to have these conversations with our families, with our co-workers, with our state legislators, so we can get people to understanding the moral and fiscal costs of dealing with these issues in our justice systems.
Yeah, I would just quickly, I think we have to ensure that everyone reframes the discussion. We have to continue to look at how we've over-criminalized, as Allison said. We have called everything a crime. It's almost impossible for certain people in certain areas not to go to jail just for making an honest mistake. So we have to look at that and where we are at the present. I think long-term, it's not sexy. The media doesn't talk about it much. They'll never make a movie about it. But if we really want to address the human conditions that contribute to social disorder and potentially crime, we have to look at prenatal care. We have to look at postnatal care. We have to really understand the good of the nurse-family partnership program. We have to understand the essence of being able to read at grade level by, I think it's 2nd or 3rd grade. We could get our hands around that. So many of these issues that we're dealing with now would be solved.
I'm hopeful because I'm a solution finder. That's just what I do. So I have to be hopeful. But I will say that I think the biggest challenge that we have is that we have to just be willing to acknowledge that we're not starting at a place of equality. We're starting at a place where we're broken. And so there are going to have to be resources that are going to flow in directions that aren't equal, that aren't even, but they're equitable. And they're making up for the significant damage that we've already done. So we have a way to work forward before we can even get to the place where the land of the free and the brave and equality is meaningful again.
I'm hopeful because there's good people like those here on this panel and all of you that are here today that care. I think the conversation continues to be elevated and that we learn new ways to discuss it and bring it to the attention. A couple of the questions that we didn't get to, I hope that you will bring up in the breakout sessions following this panel. I know you're going to continue throughout the afternoon. And finally, and Michelle just distracted me, so I don't know what the final was.
Thank you. You want to thank the people?
I do want to thank everybody, yes, but I know you're going to do that. No. I wanted to say, oh, I lost it. That's okay. That happened.
If it comes up while I'm giving these instructions,
okay.
just interrupt me. So first of all, really, so much thanks to Judge Hightower and to all of the members of the panel. So please join me in thanking them.